firms can win the struggle that will ensue if and when the playing field is leveled. So that's hopefully what I'll get to talk about today also. Okay. Well, I thought there'd be a few more panelists, so I thought my time would be cut rather short. So I'm only really prepared to speak in summary. The kind of the thesis of my paper is that Indian law firms, in order to compete, will need to be stronger and larger than they currently are. The model of the family-run law firm will not be able to compete with a law firm that has 600 partners worldwide. This will not work. And I take that as the fundamental premise because I've seen the same thing in New York. The first two law firms that I worked with when I was doing my summer internships were about 30 partners. So they weren't family run, but they were close to that. By the time I graduated from law school, both of them had been driven out of business by the larger law firms. And so then, of course, I went to one of the big 600 partner law firms with presence worldwide. And I saw the same thing happening in country after country as I worked on international deals, that as a market matured, as the legal market opened to foreign competition, the local firms that were small and didn't have their procedures institutionalized got left behind. On the other hand, there are firms, for instance, in Brazil and Argentina, that have done very, very well for themselves. Because before the international law firms started to focus attention, they took the steps necessary to defend themselves. And in fact, go out on the offensive. And now many of them have offices, many Brazilian law firms have offices in the United States and in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe. And a lot of them done very well for themselves. On the other hand, Mexican law firms didn't prepare and were almost wiped out by international law firms. So I would like India to be more like Brazil and less like Mexico. And there are many different ways you can take that, but the main advice I would have is firms must get larger and stronger. Okay, so how do you do that? It's easy. That's a pretty easy observation to make. And as I said, the starting point, I think, is the reliance on the family business model will not survive. So what does that mean? Currently in India, there's no way for lawyers to get together in a form of limited liability. There are no limited liability partnerships, no limited partnerships, no limited liability companies, general partnership, no more than 20, if I'm not mistaken, partners, right? So first, to change this model, I think there must be some form of legal change. There must be another way for Indian lawyers to get together. Now, not only will that allow the size to grow, but I admit I have a few cousins that aren't the sharpest crayons in the box, and I would much rather accept unlimited liability for their acts, because they're my family, than I would for a very competent lawyer that I was in practice with who was not a member of my family. It's human nature. That's the way we all are. So to ask Indian lawyers to build large law firms, but yet accept general partner status and unlimited liability for the mistakes of their partners is not something that's really going to work. And it's not something that the other law firms have to do. They're all set up as LLCs, LPs, or LLPs. So I think my first piece of advice is that there must be some better legal arrangement for lawyers to organize to help to start break down the family model and to help to allow the firms to grow beyond 20 partners. Second of all, I think, assuming that is able to happen, then you have to look at the mentality of a lot of the people in the room who are senior members of law firms and how they share wealth, accolades, and power within the law firm. And it's difficult to give up control. It's difficult to give up the reins. And if foreign law firms will never be allowed in, then it's probably not necessary. But if they are going to be allowed in, it will be absolutely necessary that you somehow keep your highest merit and experienced advocates on board with you so that you can attain a critical mass. So assuming that you're able to do that in a limited liability form, how do you do that? Is kind of the next step. And I think the first key is you have to have those people there once they get the experience. What I've seen happening in Indian law firms is as soon as people get experience, there's no reason for them to not quit, move across the street, open up their own firm and charge exactly the same rates that their old firm was charging. Therefore, they're the boss. They get to keep a higher percentage of the take, and they end up being happier and wealthier. So, if you want your law firm to be the one that grows instead of the guy across the street who's left you, then what you have to do is figure out how to hold on to that guy so that he's there when he's of a level to be made a partner. And I think there are pretty much 4 ways to do that. I think when you talk about retention, which is really what we're talking about, the reason that people stay in a job is largely the same reason they take a job. So think about the last time you applied for a job, what you looked for when you went to that job. And I think it breaks down to typically 4 things. Money, work environment, opportunity, and I'll just stick to those 3. The 4th one slips my mind. I was going to write that one off anyway. As I'll write off work environment. If anybody goes to work in a law firm for the work environment, they're an idiot. So we don't really even need to discuss that. I'm not going to say we should have nicer work environments. I've worked in a lot of law firms, and I know thousands of people work in law firms, and very few people are happy with the work environment. So I'm not going to say the work environment should improve. But salary is salary. It's money, and we don't have to have an intellectual debate on that. Everyone understands if you pay someone more, they'll come to work with you and they'll stay with you. So I don't want to discuss that. What I want to focus on is opportunity. And there are a few aspects of opportunity. The chief most one is education, training. I think if you bring in lawyers and you show them that they will have a chance to grow and be trained, they'll be a lot more likely to stick around. As by way of some examples, in the U.S. law firm, we had a corporate department lunch every Thursday. Every Tuesday, we had a project finance lunch. And every Wednesday, we had an international transactions lunch. So, I hardly ever had to pay for lunch when I worked in New York. But I got a lot of training. And it wasn't just when the partners didn't have anything to do, they would sit down and train us. It was a systematic form of training that we all came to expect. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but it was highly encouraged. And when my reviews came around at the end of the year, they had a roll call. They knew how many trainings I had attended. And if I hadn't gone to enough, they would say, what's wrong? Don't you care about your career? Don't you want to become a better lawyer? Why can't you devote some time to training? We're offering it to you. Why aren't you taking it? So that's those are the people you'll have to compete against when the legal market's open. They've been training their advocates like that from day one. In addition to that, they'll pay tens of thousands of dollars to have outside advisors come in on a very specialized topic and teach a class to their junior mid-level advocates. On top of that, they give, my law firm, for example, give $1,000 a year to me as a stipend to buy books and attend outside courses, which was, really, it was a little bit shocking for the time in New York, but now a lot more firms are doing that. So these are the kind of things I talk about training. Young lawyers come in, they're not well equipped from law school. That's true in every country. So you have to take them and mold them and make them something useful. They're your chief raw material in your business, and your business is billable hours or transaction fees or case fees, and it's your job to transform that raw asset into the highest yielding type of asset it can be. And one of the ways to do that is through training. And what I've seen in Indian law firms is not anywhere near what I described in my experience in U.S. law firms. And I don't need to tell you what the situation in Indian law firms is. I think you all know that, being that you're working in Indian law firms. You have worked in Indian law firms. So I'll leave that to you. But I think if you provide training, that guy who's thinking about leaving and going across the street, one of the first things he's going to say is, well, if I leave and go across the street, who's going to train me? How am I going to get better? If I'm running the show, how am I going to continue my education? How am I going to become a better lawyer who can eventually make even more money? So I'll leave the education there and I'll move on to the next thing, which is the second way to keep those people from moving across the street is true of any business model, which is to create barriers to entry. So how can a law firm create barriers to entry? The person across the street can hire the same lawyers that I can hire. Currently, he can charge the same hourly rates that I can charge, so he can probably pay as much to the new lawyers as I can. What are the barriers to entry in the service industry we can create to allow our firm to grow? There are a number, and the first one I talk about is IT. Again, contrasting the situation here in India, which is fine. I'm able to get work. I see the lawyers in the firm are able to get work done, but the difference is tremendous. In New York, I don't think I ever saw a fax machine. I know they had them somewhere because I received faxes and I sent faxes, but I never saw them. I could actually go in, sit at my desk all day long, from 9 in the morning to midnight, and not get up and leave once because of the information, not only the information technology that was there, but also the IT professionals that were there to take care of any need I had. If the computer jammed, if the printer was out of paper or something, it was taken care of. And that allowed me to be much more efficient, which allowed the firm to bill me out at a much higher rate. And I thought, wow, when I left, my rate was $420 an hour, and I thought that there's no way I could be this efficient. So there's no way I could go across the street, open up my own firm, and charge $420 an hour. So IT services is one. Second is support staff. In most international law firms, there's one secretary for each 3 advocates, and the secretaries are good. They're some of the best secretaries in New York City or London, and they're paid very well. I think the secretary in New York, a good experienced secretary in New York, made about half as much as a first-year advocate in a law firm, to give you a rough idea of what they made. And if I needed another secretary at night, I could have a second secretary put on to take care of things. Again, if there were these guys that made photocopies, and I hardly ever saw them, but they had these massive machines, and they ran all the photocopies. I didn't have to ever go to the photocopier. If I needed them 1 hour, I got them 1 hour. I didn't have to wait 2 hours, 3 hours. Didn't have to miss any deadlines. So providing the service staff around the people, right? Because again, if I want to move across the street and I'm looking at how much money I can make, and I think, well, I've got to hire an IT guy, I've got to hire a secretary, I've got to hire a photocopy guy, I've got to hire all these people. I can't afford all that overhead. It's just better to stay here. So by creating this kind of service-related and highly qualified, properly compensated service staff, I think you can create another very good barrier to entry. And then the final aspect of that I would talk about is marketing. And here again, when I started my talk, I said I think there's some institutional change that has to happen first before the law firms can make the changes they need to make. And it's the same thing here. I mean, as long as Indian law firms operate in isolation, a prohibition on advertising is a level playing field. But if the market's open, your competitors will not be, at least outside of India, they will not be restricted by such a ban on advertising. And so, that's one of the big ways that barriers to entry are created in other countries is through advertising, getting the name out. I'm not talking about advertising on television and billboards and things like that, but websites, sponsorships, a bit of kind of blatant advertising, but in professional magazines where people would be doing business transactions and things. I mean, I'm not talking about people that say, if you're in a car accident, call me. Not like that. But you will be competing against those people. And hopefully the Indian law firms will be able to represent not only people going to, undergoing transactions in India, but also Indian companies going overseas. And this is a bit of a disadvantage that Indian companies are at as we see more and more of them every year going overseas. When a U.S. company wants to go overseas, it has its own law firm that it's worked with a long time. It's very comfortable with them. It knows the level of service. The lawyers know the expectation of the client. They go overseas, the first thing they do is they go back to their law firm and they say, we're going overseas. Can you help us in Japan? Can you help us in France? And hopefully the law firm says yes, and things move along smoothly. But because the Indian legal profession has been a bit sheltered, the Indian firms don't have that overseas exposure, that overseas experience. So when Reliance wants to go overseas, they don't go back to their Indian law firm and say, we're going overseas, come with us, help us. Instead they leave and they go to a foreign law firm. And the foreign law firm's advertising over there. So as the Indian law firms try to make inroads into this overseas market, the restriction on advertising is going to make it difficult. So it's going to hurt in two ways, not only with that competing internationally, and therefore Indian companies suffer. And Reliance would be better served if it could take